Hi, everybody. My name is Lily. I'm from the USA, San Diego, California, and I am so happy to be here to teach you guys all about biodiversity. It's one of my favorite units in ecology. So, everybody get their notes ready and let's begin the lesson together. Okay, so first we should review the food chains and the food webs. We're going to be jumping right into this lesson. Now, food chains and food webs. Basically, a food chain, it's just a model that shows the flow of nutritional energy through an ecosystem. It shows which organism eats which organism, right? It shows that pattern. And each section of the food chain is called a trophic level. So if you were referring to only one part of the food chain, like a specific part, you would call that a trophic level. Now, a food chain, it displays the path of food from organism to organism. It's a nutritional flow, right? And so all food chains are going to start with the sun as the first source of energy, which is transformed into food by producers, right? So producers, they use photosynthesis to transform the energy in the sun into stored energy, right? Glucose or sugars. And us consumers can't do that, right? If we go in the sun and lay there for a while, we might get a little tan, but we're not going to be producing foods in our bodies. If we were able to do that, then we wouldn't have to eat anything, right? We would already get all our nutrients from ourselves. But that's not the case for us. We are consumers, therefore, we must consume either other consumers or plants. And it's good to have a mix of both, right? And so we start with the sun, the first source of energy, and this is transferred into food by the producers, right? And then it goes onward. We're going to see a little example of this. And remember, a food web, it's a collection of food chain. It's like all the chains coming together into a little web, right? And food webs are usually more accurate because in an ecosystem, you don't have one animal eating just one other animal. Other animals, we eat multiple things. It's not like we eat only one food source. We have other sources of subsistence. And here's an example. And so notice that the food chain is just like a linear, model. You start with the producers over here, and then from the producers, you get to the primary consumers, right? The primary consumers eat the producers. Then we're going to get to the secondary consumers. Like in this example, it's the snake. The snake eats the hare. And then from the secondary consumers to the higher level, you have the tertiary consumers, right? And these consumers may or may not have additional predators. In this case, we have a hawk, and hawks aren't known to have predators, right? So these are apex predators. Anyways, it's like it's showing where the energy is flowing from one level to the next. And you may notice that at the bottom, this might be a new term. It's called decomposers. So I'm going to explain a little bit what decomposers are. So decomposers, they're comprised of fungi, bacteria, and what they do is they break down organic matter. So when we die, our body is organic matter. Our body contains the elements on earth, right? It contains all the nutrients in our bodies, right? And so what decomposers do is they're going to take our body and break it down. They're going to break it down into little nutrients, and these nutrients are going to nourish the soil. It's going to make the soil rich in nutrients, right, from our own bodies. And in the dirt and the soils, now we're going to go into plants like as minerals, or we're just going to be cycled through. It's like fertilizing the soil. It's like a natural fertilizer, And for the food web, let's move on to the food web. For the food web, see, it's a little more convoluted. There's a lot more arrows going around everywhere. This is some demonstration of multiple food chains all happening at once. So you see that the rabbit, it goes to the coyote, it goes to the snake, and it goes to the hawk. Like over here, let me show you guys. So you have this hare, it's going to go to the coyote, it's going to go to the snake, and it's going to go all the way to the hawk, right? So there are multiple pathways. Over here, this little grasshopper can go to the coyote, and it also goes to the snake. And notice that everyone, all of these primary consumers, they're still consuming the producers, right? They need the producers to live because we cannot make food on our own, right? And notice over here, the snake is going to go to the hawk. And, it's just a connection of different food chains intermingling with one another. And so notice that reality is so much more complex than one little food chain, right? Because organisms, they eat a variety of food. This is why a food web more accurately models the interaction between organisms in an ecosystem. Alrighty, so this brings us to ecosystem organization, and we're going to be exploring ecological niches and keystone species. So let's start with how an ecosystem is organized, right? So we're looking at ecosystem on the macro scale. Macro means big, so on the larger scale. So we start off with the individual, right? I'm an individual, you're an individual, but us individuals together form a population. So in this picture, you have an elk, and the elk is by itself, but when it's in a group, it's called a population. Next, you have a community. And in a community, there are multiple populations together. So multiple populations of different species. You see a variety of animals. I see a little hare over there. This looks like it might be, I'm not sure what this animal is. It looked like it could be a monkey, or I'm not quite sure exactly. Over here is an owl. Over here is, this looks like it could be a coyote. And then over here is a moose, right? Then in an ecosystem consists of the community and also the non-living constituents. So you have the biotic and abiotic factor. So if you can remember from a couple weeks ago, last week I think it was, when we first learned about it, or 2 weeks before. I don't remember clearly, but we learned about the biotic and the abiotic factors. You guys remember what biotic and abiotic means? I hope you guys remember that biotic means the living things in the ecosystem, and the abiotic factors are the non-living things, like the water, the sunlight, the temperature, the soil. We all need abiotic factors to live. And then from an ecosystem, a collection of different ecosystems that are around the same place and have similar climates, is a biome. And the biosphere are all those biomes combined. So it's the entire Earth as like the biosphere, right? So you can see how you go from the individual all the way to all of Earth. I think it's pretty cool, that level of organization in life. And this leads us to talk about ecological niches. So what exactly is an ecological niche? Well, in simple terms, it's basically just an organism's unique role in an ecosystem. And the niche can include the types of food the organism eats, where it lives, where it reproduces, and its relationship to other species. So basically everything that the organism does, its role in the environment, right? And so organisms with similar niches engage in competition for resources. So if there are too many organisms with similar roles, they're going to engage in competition because they're going to be using up the same resources. And of course, nature has only a limited supply of resources, right? And so not everybody can have the same resources. Like if they're like in your class or something, if there was like one pencil left and multiple of you guys needed it, only one person can get it, not all of you, right? Same thing works in nature. If there's not enough resources for everybody, not everybody's going to get the same resources. And this can cause some species to die out, right? Because they're not getting the same resources. And so this brings up a really important topic, which are invasive species. Now, invasive species, they are foreign invaders. And what they do is they take over niches of native animals and can cause native animals to go extinct. Some invasive species can be a type of plant. Like if a new plant, like if you brought seeds from another country to a different country and started planting them, that plant is an invasive species, and it's competing for the same resources as the native plants, right? And this can cause a disaster because now these invasive species, they typically don't have natural predators. So there's really nothing to keep those invasive species in check. They don't belong in that ecosystem and they can't be controlled. So they disrupt the balance of the overall ecosystem by taking up the resources, right? And driving out all the native species into extinction. So this is a really big ecological problem that some places are facing right now. There's always going to be like invasive species. And so an ecosystem with a variety of niches is stable. It's really important for an ecosystem to have multiple niches so that multiple different types of species can survive. So basically, in summary, think of niches as an organism's role and its lifestyle. And remember, it's really important for each organism to have a unique role or lifestyle. So yeah, be unique. Okay, so here's like a really good example of similar animals. They're all birds, but they're occupying different ecological niches. And these arise from different adaptations. So you see the really big flamingo here, right? The flamingo. It has a really long neck and it can go on the steeper end of the pool and it can eat the resources in this area, right? So what these birds did is they distributed the resources based on their adaptations. The duck over here can reach the resources here, and so no other species is going to inhabit this area. It's only for the duck, right? So this reduces competition. You're not going to have multiple species competing for the same resources. They all get to have their different resources. Over here, this animal has its own little territory, and we can go all the way here to the plover, which has the surface, right? And so it's really important to distribute the environment or habitat so that we can avoid competition and use up the resources efficiently and effectively. And so adaptations help animals survive, right? And adaptation is some type of different traits that can serve as an advantage in an environment. So think of adaptations as traits, like different individual traits that an animal has developed. So our next section deals with keystone species, and there are three main types of keystone species. We have predators, we have mutualists, and we have ecosystem engineers. And keystone species have really big niches. They have a huge impact, like an unusually huge impact on an environment, that if you were to remove a keystone species, that environment is gonna collapse because they play such a huge role. So over here, let's talk about more in depth each of the keystone species involved in ecosystem organization. So first of all, we have predators, and we've already studied predators and prey and how they keep each other in balance, right? So predators play a really important role in controlling the prey population. If there are no predators, the prey population is going to go out of whack. It's going to have so many preys in using up all of the resources, right? And again, these resources are limited. There's not enough for everyone, right? If there's too many prey using up the resources, the ecosystem's balance is disrupted and it's going to collapse. This is why we need predators to keep things in control. Now we have ecosystem engineers, and these create change or they can destroy the environment, right? So ecosystem engineers are basically building or constructing the environment. Then we have mutualists, which interact with other species for each other's benefits. They engage in symbiosis, and they're the reason why some species live, because of those beneficial interactions. Other species are reliant on these mutualists. If you remove a mutualist from the environment, then those other species, they can no longer depend on that animal, right? So they're going to be at a disadvantage, and without help, they might not be able to survive on their own. So this is why keystone species are super important for maintaining an ecosystem. And we're going to explore one of the keystone species that's actually in Belize. And so this is the honey bear, and there's a little picture of it. And so the honey bear, it's a nocturnal animal and it lives in Belize's rainforests. And these animals mostly consume fruits, insects, and honey. So this makes it an omnivore. It consumes producers like the fruit and insects, right? And its major role is to disperse seeds. So what the honey bear does is that it consumes like different fruits with different seeds, and as it dispenses the waste through the excretory system, it's going to be spreading those seeds, right? And the honey bear are also major pollinators like bees. So you see how these animals play a lot. This animal plays it fills up so many roles, right? And so it has a really big impact on the ecosystem. So without this keystone species, a large part of the ecosystem, it's gonna collapse. And I have bad news. So sadly, due to deforestation and habitat destructions, these little critters are declining. There's less and less of them. They're not endangered yet. But if the deforestation keeps going, we might lose these really important species. This is why it's important to practice environmental conservation so that we can maintain these species and they don't go extinct. And so I have a question for you guys. So what kind of keystone species is the kinkajou or the honey bear? So teachers, you may pause the video over here and have the class discuss which type of keystone species it could be, and then I'll give the answer. All right, so now that we can resume the lesson, the honey bear is actually an ecosystem engineer. It's rebuilding the environment, constructing it. So it's by dispersing seeds and acting as a pollinator. So this animal determines the types of trees that are going to be in the ecosystem and the types of plants. It's an ecosystem engineer. And so it plays a really important part in this ecosystem in making variety and creating diversity. This brings us to biodiversity. And we're going to explore why biodiversity is so important and human impacts on biodiversity. Alrighty, so number one, what is biodiversity in the first place? This is a little quick recap. So remember, biodiversity is the variety of life in a specific ecosystem. And it's important because it keeps the ecosystem healthy and balanced. So there's like this little sequence going on here. The more diverse the ecosystem, the more available resources, right? The more available resources in an ecosystem, the more available niches. There can be a lot more unique niches because these niches are dependent on the types of species in an environment and the resources. And so if there's more niches in an ecosystem, more species can inhabit that ecosystem, so you have more variety. And so a biodiverse ecosystem can support more food chains, and they can also recover from disasters faster because there are so many different species with different roles that it can help rebuild the ecosystem after like a wildfire or an earthquake, right? If an ecosystem was not biodiverse and lacked a lot of species and diversity, then it's more likely to die out after like a natural disaster. Okay, and there's more to variation in the ecosystems. So we're going to explain why genetic variation specifically can be really important with an example. So the more genetically diverse a population is, meaning that it has a lot of different traits, lots of different types of individuals that are all unique. When you have more genetic diversity, the ecosystem is more resistant to change in the environment. Okay, so let's first talk about the Dutch elm disease. And so Dutch elm, it's a type of tree. And there's a really fatal fungal disease that makes these trees really sick. And these trees are going to rot and die. So in this picture, you see a tree rotting, which is so sad. And this is where genetic diversity comes into play. So there are some resistant trees with tolerant strains. So this means that it's able to resist the disease because its DNA is slightly different. So remember, genetic diversity is a difference in a DNA. It's dependent on what the genetic material, the DNA. And all of us, we look different because our DNAs are slightly different, right? And where do these differences come from? Well, if you can think back a few weeks ago, differences come from mutations. When there's a mutation in DNA, you have a new trait, right? And so these trees have mutations that are advantageous, right? They're good mutations, not the bad ones that lead to disorders, but the good, helpful ones. So the mutations leads to resistant trees. And these trees, via natural selection, remember evolution, these trees are going to be able to survive the disease, right? And then there's going to be more resistant trees as these surviving trees reproduce. And so right now, the population of Dutch elm is beginning to rebound because of these new strains and this new DNA in trees that is helping it survive, right? It's helping it resist this fungal disease. And so imagine if all of these trees were genetically identical. They had the same exact DNA, right? Well, all of these will not be resistant to the fungus, right? All of these diseases won't be able to fight it off or be immune to it. So they would all die from the disease and become extinct. So this is why genetic diversity is super important within a population, because as your environment is changing, you at least know that there are going to be some survivors with different traits that are advantageous. And this brings us to human impact on biodiversity. And this might be the most important section over here, because I want you guys all to pay close attention here, because this is a serious issue and it's happening right now every single second. So the first one is deforestation. And in deforestation, people are removing trees. Land is being cleared and it removes available land, destroying habitats. And these species, they don't have a habitat for their ecosystem now. And so why are we clearing up trees for? Well, examples include land being cleared up to build homes, to create industrial sites, to create cities, to create farms, lands of agriculture, plantations, all of those different reasons. But if we're going overboard and clearing up so much trees, this is really bad for the environment. Now, I want you guys to all think for a second, what do we need trees for? Okay, so I want you guys to have like a little moment to think to yourselves. Teachers, you may pause the video and you may discuss with the class the different roles that trees play and why trees are really important for us. Okay, so now we can resume the lesson. Trees, remember, in photosynthesis, they also create oxygen for us to breathe. We breathe in oxygen. Oxygen is very important for us, right? And without these trees, we wouldn't have a lot of oxygen and there would be so much carbon dioxide in the air. So these trees, they're like carbon sinks, right? So they take in the carbon dioxide and make oxygen out of it. And so we need this oxygen to survive. And if there's too much, remember, if there's too much carbon dioxide in the air, global warming, right? So this is why trees are known as carbon sinks. And if we remove the trees, which contain all the carbon dioxide and lots of carbon, then there's going to be so much carbon in the air. It's going to have so much pollution. We need these trees to purify the air around us so that we can breathe in fresh air. And also, trees are habitats to other animals, right? Maybe some of you guys mentioned how like organisms live in trees. There's some birds that need trees for building their nests. So trees have so many different roles. These are habitats for other animals. Trees can also provide shade. Some animals really need this shade to live, and so they don't burn from the heat of the sunlight, right? So it's really important that we maintain our trees and we keep them healthy, right? And we don't clear all of them. Now, the next issue is draining wetlands for building sites, and wetlands is a huge ecosystem with so many animals, birds, marine animals, the like. Also, using too many pesticides is really bad for the environment because pesticides are so toxic to animals, and pesticides leach into our groundwater through runoff, right? And so if our groundwater becomes contaminated, we won't be able to consume it. And pesticides, when there's too much pesticides going into the water, because pesticides, remember, they're meant to nourish plants. There's supposed to be a lot of nutrients. This results in eutrophication. And eutrophication is a really fancy word for algae blooms. So in the water, you might see that there's like little algae, right? These green plants. Well, if there's so many nutrients, then these green plants, the algae, are going to fill up the water. You're going to see like entire ponds that are completely green because they have algae growing all over the place. And this can be an issue because these algae are taking up they're blocking the water from getting its oxygen. So the marine life underneath, they're not going to be able to receive oxygen, and they're also going to die. It hurts their health. And the next issue is introducing invasive species. And we touched on this a little bit when I was talking about invasive species, how they're a threat to native species and increased competition. Okay, so this leads us to our next issue, which is overfishing. And overfishing is a really big deal because it's removing the balance of fish required in an ecosystem, right? And so when we're removing so much fish, we're impacting the ecosystems. We might be removing too much prey so the predators aren't able to consume anything and they're going to die off. And then this leads us to plastic pollution and air pollution, which are so toxic to animals. It can air pollution can contaminate our lungs, our water supplies, and it impacts the soil's balance. The soil needs specific nutrients in it, and if we put toxins in it, it's not going to be as healthy. And plastic is a really big deal. When people are littering plastics and plastics are getting into the ocean, those sea animals think that plastics are food. So they're going to eat that plastic, which is really toxic. It's a really bad chemical for them. And when they consume those plastics, they're going to think that they're full and they're not going to eat anything else, right? Because they're going to, like, for a while, because they think that the plastic is enough. And when they eat that plastic, they're not getting nutrients at all, which are really vital for their organs to function and for them to just live as a whole. It's really important to get nutrients for survival and proper nourishment. You guys have learned through like the healthy plate unit or your diet unit that it's really important to have a balance of nutrients. And if you're consuming plastics, you're not getting any of those nutrients. So this is why it's really important for us to look at our impacts and try to make things better and sort of reverse our impact on biodiversity by adopting sustainable practices. So this leads us to our next section. Our next section deals with conservation and sustainable practices. And so what can you do to help your ecosystem? For one, picking up trash or litter on the streets is a really good idea. Maybe you guys live next to a beach or somewhere coastal or near like rivers or ponds. Well, what you can do is maybe like start like a beach cleanup together, or like as a class, you guys can clean up or like the area around you. Anywhere you're at school or you're at home, or maybe you go outside, you see trash in the streets, pick it up because you don't know where that trash can go. That trash can go into the water systems, right? And it could eventually sometime end up in the oceans, and then maybe an animal's going to eat it and get really hurt from it. Another thing you can do is you can compost foods like banana fields and apple cores instead of throwing them in the trash. So anything that is natural, like fruits or vegetables, instead of throwing them into trash, like banana peels and everything, you can actually bury them outside in the dirt so that nature itself can decompose those nutrients and recycle it back into the ecosystem. That's a very good way to um, minimize our trash and landfill, right? Another big, like really great solution is replanting trees and plants. So when you're planting trees in your community, you're going to be restoring your ecosystems, and you're also going to have fresher, cleaner air because these trees are going to help clean the air. So if you guys plant trees and plant more plants, that can help your ecosystem a lot. You'll be doing a really great service for your ecosystem. Another idea is to reduce meat consumption. Now, meat consumption is associated with a lot of environmental problems. There's so many cows over there, so many different animals, and they release a lot of methane, right? And these like cow farts, and so that can pollute the earth. It can contribute to pollution. And so there's too many land animals, it's going to contribute to global warming. So in order to reduce the amount of animals, you should reduce your meat consumption so that there is lesser demand. Another solution would be to donate to endangered animal charities to help these endangered animals. Maybe some of these animals are keystone species. Remember, each animal, no matter what role it plays, is super important in an ecosystem. Another solution is to switch to renewable resources, more involve saving electricity and water, as we discussed last week. And another pretty simple solution is if you have a bike, perhaps consider riding bikes more instead of only relying on automobiles. And so instead of always driving around in a car, you can ride a bike. And this would be really good for the ecosystem because you're releasing a lot less carbon dioxide into the air. And so, yeah, those are the different practices you may adopt and include in your lifestyle to help your environment. And so, thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and maybe this week challenge yourself and try out one of these sustainable practices, whether it be composting, maybe recycle something, and yeah, challenge yourself. You'll be not only challenging yourself, but also helping your ecosystem so much in your environment. We all live in this earth, and it is our role to make sure that our earth is healthy, because if our earth is unhealthy, well, then that's going to impact us, right? We need the earth to live, and we have to make sure that our planet is healthy for us to prosper. So thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody.